is going to focus on first on risk communication challenges from a risk analysis standpoint. And then possibilities, just throwing out some possibilities about how we could better communicate about risk to the various publics that we deal with, and also communicate with them and engage them in the process of risk analysis, very much in favor of kind of the analytical deliberative process that the National Academies recommended over a decade ago. So I'll be talking a little bit about that and how that fits. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about integrating some of these concepts across the various disciplines that we're coming at this from. I'm coming from a biochemist / risk analysis / public policy perspective, but I know we have philosophers in the room and communication scientists and molecular toxicologists. And so how do we come together to improve the field of risk communication, which by its very nature should be multidisciplinary and hopefully someday interdisciplinary. And so I don't directly work in the area of risk communication other than being a co-PI on this project, which David will notice is on my slide and was always there. So I'm looking forward to being engaged in this new NERT, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my other work and how it might relate to the field of communication as well. So I have 2 NSF grants that I'll be talking about on other dimensions of nanotechnology as well. So it's going to be a little bit of a hodgepodge, but hopefully some of the lessons, that was another word from yesterday, will come together in the end. My favorite definition of risk communication is that it comes from Morgan's book, Risk Communication, a Mental Models Approach. And when I teach my risk analysis class, we use this definition. I know there are hundreds of definitions out there, and in fact, the IRGC report, International Risk Governance Council, has a nice report where you can go to the back and you can get all the definitions, the various definitions from different countries and different international and national organizations about what is risk analysis, what is risk communication, and you will see hundreds of definitions. And I think that is one problem with the field, is that we sometimes do not speak the same language when we say risk communication or risk assessment. What does it really mean? Like yesterday we had a discussion, what is risk? Does it include severity or just probability or both? So anyway, this is the definition, not to go off on too many tangents here. Risk communication is an exchange of information about risk among decision makers, stakeholders, and the public, which is intended to supply people with the information they need to make informed and independent judgments about risk. And I particularly like this definition because of the words exchange, among, informed, and independent. Okay, I think they codify some of the principles we talked about yesterday. So, we've heard about the deficit model of communication, and I am very much not in favor of that model, but I do like to think about an enabling model so that people can have a better capacity to understand individual studies about risk and put them in a context of what do those individual studies mean, because quite frankly, risk analysis doesn't come in one chunk at the public. It comes in a bunch of individual studies, one on carbon nanotubes, one on buckyballs, one on titanium dioxide, and so there's a time component, and there's like a little, I think of like throwing paint against the wall or something. There's sprays of information that come out at various times. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, just throwing out some ideas of how we might better put those individual studies about risk into the context of risk analysis and what is risk. So in this book, they also say that the purposes of risk communication, we've kind of evolved as a field of risk analysis from advice and answers to just give me the numbers to context and framing, and that different publics, so different groups of public people, want different things. I'm going to very much focus more on the context and framing than the advice and answers and number dimensions or goals of risk communication. So that's sort of setting up what is my definition of risk communication and how do I view it. I also believe, this is a schematic that I drew for a recent book chapter. Risk communication is an integral part of risk analysis. And my area of research is more on risk policy, which combines all these dimensions of risk analysis. So that's just to show you a more sophisticated model, I think, of risk communication comes from the book Mad Cows and Mother's Milk, which I think is a really nice book about risk communication. I use it in my course. And I like this picture where this multi-way communication is really the hub of risk analysis. So I don't need to tell this group more about that. Okay, so then what are the challenges? And these were touched upon yesterday, but in this same book, there seems to be barriers and vacuums, as Doug Powell puts it, between the expert assessment of risk, which is scientific probabilistic, and public assessment of risk, which is more intuitive. Sometimes people want advice, although I think, a yes or no answer, although I think that various publics are much more sophisticated than just wanting a yes or no answer, but we can get to that later. And so how do we take kind of this fuzzy information and turn it into something that's useful for people for making decisions, and informed decisions, and enable them to make those decisions independently. So more specifically, what is the work that good risk communication practice seeks to do? Translate into understandable terms, explain uncertainty ranges, knowledge gaps, and ongoing research programs, address the issue of building credibility and trust. So again, these are things that we've talked about yesterday. Credibility and trust is extremely important, but also I do believe that the public, some publics, many publics, we were talking about this morning in the van how it's not just one public. There's different groups of public people, different ecologies of publics, but I really do believe that we have an obligation to give them a sense of the sophistication of information that's coming out of risk analysis and science, and that they do have the ability to understand that if they want to take the time to engage, and if we want to take the time as scientists and risk analysts to engage with them. And so we also need to understand the public's framing of the risk issue, especially its qualitative dimension, and that's that bi-directional thing that John Stone talked about yesterday, which is extremely important, is getting phase, which would to incorporate that local and specialized knowledge, which can inform risk analysis in the quantitative, in the scientific or empirical part of risk assessment. So I don't actually think that there's that much of a distinction between subjective and objective risk, and between the ethical and social dimensions of risk and the empirical. So I'll talk more about that later. So this bidirectional is extremely important. So another way of putting it is Kunth, this obscure paper that I'm not sure if any of you have read, but I like the diagram. It's from the Journal of Fisheries Management. We have the various filters we talked about, and message modulators, which is the credibility of the messenger, cultural, social, and operational factors, and also the channels of communication. And they can cause distortion of the unintended messages. I'm not so sure I like that distortion word very much, but I do like the schematic that we're up against a big challenge here, as you all know. I did want to mention that the IRGC report and this figure from it about the different types of risks or different categories of risk, and what the dominant characteristic of the risk is, and how the communication or engagement process may require different strategies depending on the characteristic of the risk. So not a one-size-fits-all kind of approach to engagement and stakeholder involvement. So we have various risks that this report classifies as simple. So that may be a typical, how much of the hazard or how much of the substance do you need to drink? You know it's in drinking water. What's the dose response curve? What's the exposure? We're generally familiar with the knowledge that we need, and we have a lot of the knowledge to assess the risk. And that would be considered a simple type of risk. But then we go into areas where there's a lot more complexity, and they give the examples that this would be a simple train wreck, for example.